The battlefield was a nightmare. Lieutenant Marcus Price crouched behind the twisted remains of a shattered building, breathing heavily. His body ached from the hours of running, fighting, and surviving. His once pristine uniform was torn and stained with dirt and blood. His helmet, cracked along one side, had already fallen off, leaving his short-cropped hair matted with sweat. The ground beneath him trembled as another Zarak war machine rumbled by, its massive feet crushing what remained of human defenses. The enemy's soldiers, taller and stronger than any human, marched in perfect unison, their weapons glinting in the blood-red light of a dying sun. The Zarak were ruthless, their technology light years ahead of anything humanity had ever dreamed of. Their ships had blasted Earth's cities into dust, their armies unstoppable. And now they were closing in on what was left of the resistance. Marcus's mind raced, but his heart was heavy. His squad, the men and women he'd fought beside for years, were gone. They'd been wiped out in the initial assault. He had watched them fall one by one, their screams still echoing in his mind. The faces of his fallen comrades haunted him, but he couldn't afford to grieve. Not yet. There was still a fight to win. There was still hope. He peeked around the corner, trying to assess the situation. The city, once full of life, was now a wasteland. Smoke choked the air, and the distant sounds of destruction rang through the streets. The Zarak were everywhere, too many, too strong. A small group of human soldiers, barely a dozen, remained scattered in the ruins. The rest had either been killed or captured. And now they were facing a new nightmare. The Zarak had unveiled a weapon no one had ever seen before. A small, deadly fruit they called the Death Apple. Marcus had heard whispers about it. No one knew exactly what it did, only that anyone who touched it, or worse, ate it, would die within minutes. It was rumored to be a biological weapon, a toxin so potent it would shut down the human body one system at a time. The nerve endings would burn, the skin would wither, and the victim would die in unimaginable agony. In his heart, Marcus knew that if the Zarak used it against the remaining humans, it would be the final blow. He couldn't let that happen. His pulse quickened as he spotted movement up ahead. Zarak soldiers were gathering near a broken street corner, their eerie blue eyes scanning the area. They were carrying baskets filled with death apples. Marcus's stomach twisted in fear. "God help us," he whispered under his breath. His hands clenched around his rifle, the weight of the weapon a cold comfort. He had only one choice now: survive long enough to stop them, to warn the others. But it was a fool's hope. How could one soldier stand against an entire army? There was no way out. His comms crackled to life, the voice of his commanding officer coming through, muffled by the static. "Lieutenant Price, do you copy? We need a report. What's the situation?" Marcus winced, the effort of speaking sending waves of pain through his body. He felt the sting of exhaustion in his limbs, the weight of loss dragging at his mind. He'd been alone too long to keep fighting. But if he didn't, who would? "Sir," he said, his voice hoarse, "they're everywhere. The Zarak are using those damn death apples if they start throwing them at us." A loud explosion cut him off. The ground shook violently as a building nearby collapsed in a cloud of dust and debris. Marcus ducked instinctively, covering his head with his arms. The air was filled with the acrid scent of burning metal and flesh. When the dust settled, Marcus dared to look up. Through the haze, he could just make out the Zarak advancing, moving toward him with cold precision. But then something strange happened. The soldiers seemed to pause. They looked up at the sky. A low rumble echoed through the air, followed by a roar. The Zarak stopped, as if waiting for something. Marcus squinted, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was coming. His eyes widened as he saw it. A Zarak ship, large enough to blot out the sun, hovering just above the city. It had to be their command vessel. If it was descending, it meant the invasion was about to enter its final phase. There was no time left. Marcus knew this was it, the last chance. His mind flashed to the faces of his fallen squad, to the homes they'd left behind. I can't die like this," he whispered, his voice breaking. The Zarak forces weren't waiting anymore. One of the alien soldiers, holding a glowing death apple in his hand, took a step forward. Marcus didn't wait. He didn't think. He moved. He surged from behind cover, charging straight toward the Zarak soldier. His rifle was raised, his fingers squeezing the trigger without hesitation. A burst of fire rang out. The first Zarak soldier fell. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The other soldiers turned. their weapons aimed, and Marcus, despite every warning, despite the screams of reason in his head, charged forward. For Earth, for his squad, for the survival of humanity. But even as he ran, his body already starting to tremble from exhaustion, a terrible thought flickered in his mind. What if this was the end? Marcus's breath came in ragged gasps, his legs pumping harder than they ever had before. His mind was foggy from exhaustion, his body screaming for rest, but there was no time for that. The Zarak soldiers were closing in, their heavy boots crushing the ground beneath them. Their weapons locked onto him, ready to end his charge. He had no plan, no escape, just the fierce will to survive. Through the smoke and chaos, Marcus's eyes locked on the death apple the Zarak soldier was holding. It gleamed with an eerie, sickly glow, like a fruit from a nightmare. A shiver ran down his spine. He'd heard the rumors, the horror stories about how the poison inside it could kill you in minutes, leaving nothing but a rotting husk behind. And yet the Zarak were using it as if it were some kind of trophy, a symbol of their power over humanity. Marcus's heart thudded against his chest as he sprinted straight toward the soldier. He fired his rifle in a blur of motion, the shots wild, but one of them found its mark. The Zarak soldier stumbled back, its massive frame falling to the ground. The death apple slipped from its hand, rolling toward Marcus. In that instant, Marcus knew he couldn't let them have it, not like this. Without thinking, he dove for the fruit, reaching out with desperate fingers, hoping he could destroy it before the Zarak could release its deadly poison. His body hit the ground with a sickening thud, his arms scraping the dirt. But he didn't care. He could already hear the distant hum of more Zarak forces coming their way, their footsteps drawing closer by the second. He grabbed the death apple just as the first Zarak soldier reached for his rifle. "Don't," Marcus shouted, as if his words could stop fate. But it was too late. Before he could fully process what was happening, Marcus brought the death apple to his lips, its slick skin brushing against his mouth. It was the only choice, the only chance to fight back. The Zarak couldn't know he was willing to face their own poison head-on. With a single, defiant motion, he bit down. The instant the juice hit his tongue, it felt like fire. His throat burned, his chest tightened, and his vision blurred as the poison began its deadly work. It was sharp, like 1,000 needles pricking his insides. His body shook violently, his knees threatening to buckle beneath him. But Marcus didn't stop. With the strength of every soldier who had ever fought beside him, he pushed himself to his feet. His head swam with dizziness, and he could feel the poison racing through his veins, but he ignored it. He was human. He could fight this. He had to. The thought of his fallen friends, his team, drove him forward. The Zarak soldiers were still closing in, their massive forms looming over him. They didn't know yet what Marcus had done, but they would. And when they did, they would come for him. But not yet. Marcus raised his rifle with trembling hands, the weapon seeming to weigh 1,000 pounds. He could feel his fingers going numb. His vision wavered in and out, and a bitter taste flooded his mouth. His breath was shallow, but he didn't care. He was going to make them regret underestimating humanity. He fired. The first shot hit its mark, and the Zarak soldier crumpled to the ground with a screech. Another bullet, another downed enemy. His rifle bucked in his hands with every shot, but his aim was true, even as the poison ate away at him. He fired again and again, his mind focused on one thing: survive. But he was running out of time. The poison was winning. He could feel his muscles seizing, his limbs growing heavier by the second. The edges of his vision darkened, and the noise around him seemed to fade. The sound of the explosions, the screeching of Zarak war machines, it all blurred into a distant hum, like a song he was too weak to hear. Stay focused," he muttered to himself, struggling to keep his balance. His fingers slipped on the rifle's grip, but he refused to drop it. Not now, not when they were so close to defeat. He had to keep going. Another Zarak soldier aimed its weapon at him. Marcus didn't have the strength to raise his rifle in time. The soldier's finger tightened on the trigger. But before the blast could reach him, a sharp pain exploded in his side. The shot wasn't from the Zarak. Marcus gasped, his hand clutching his side as he crumpled to the ground. His vision spun, the pain from the bullet mixing with the agony of the poison coursing through him. But still, he didn't let go of the rifle. He couldn't. A shadow appeared over him. "Marcus." It was Emily, the medic, the woman who had seen too much death but still fought to save what was left. She was kneeling beside him now, her hands quickly checking his wound, but Marcus barely noticed. The poison was doing its work. He managed a weak smile. "Emily, I think I ate the wrong fruit." "Marcus, you need to hold on." Emily's voice was frantic as she ripped open her med pack, pulling out syringes and vials, trying to save him, to bring him back from the brink of death. But Marcus couldn't hear her anymore. His body was shutting down. The poison was taking him, but he was still alive. And he wasn't going to give up. Not now, not like this. With his last ounce of strength, he lifted his rifle one final time. Through his blurred vision, he aimed at the approaching Zarak soldiers. "Go to hell," he whispered. And he fired. Marcus's world was slipping away. The poison from the death apple was spreading fast, creeping through his body like fire. Every breath felt like it was his last, and the pain was unbearable. His vision swam in a haze of darkness, his body numb and shaking, yet he still clung to the rifle in his hands. His fingers felt stiff as if they were made of stone, but he refused to let go. Not now, not when the Zarak were so close. He could hear the distant roar of their war machines and the steady, mechanical footsteps of their soldiers approaching. The Zarak were coming, and with them, their victory. But Marcus wasn't going to give up. His chest heaved, but each breath felt shallower. His limbs were growing heavy, his vision flickering between the world around him and a blur of nothingness. The rifle was growing harder to hold. He couldn't fight anymore, couldn't stand, couldn't do anything but wait for the end. Was this how it ended? In the middle of the carnage, with his squad gone, alone on a battlefield soaked in blood and fire, was this how humanity fell? A soft voice cut through the fog in his mind. "Marcus." His eyes fluttered open, though everything seemed like a shadow. He could barely see her, only a shape, a figure kneeling beside him. But he knew who it was Emily. Dr. Emily Harrow, the medic. She had been one of the few left behind in the human line of defense. She had patched him up 100 times before, helped him when his body was broken, brought him back from the edge when he'd been too close to death. But this time was different. "Marcus, hold on." Emily's voice trembled, frantic and full of urgency. But Marcus could barely hear her. His ears rang with the rush of blood through his head. Everything was becoming distant, fatting. He felt the pressure in his chest, his heart hammering against his ribcage, but it was slowing so slowly. "Marcus, stay with me," Emily said again, shaking him by the shoulders. She was frantic now, tears streaking down her dusty face as she worked to keep him conscious. But he could hardly stay awake. The poison had taken its toll, his vision dimmed with every passing second. The pain was almost unbearable. He couldn't move. His body wouldn't obey him. "Emily," his voice came out in a rasp, barely more than a whisper. "Don't you dare say that. Don't you dare give up on me now," she pleaded, her hands moving frantically to apply bandages to the wound on his side. But she knew the truth. The death apple poison was working faster than she could counter it. She had seen it before, but never so close, never on someone she cared about. She had never seen anyone survive the death apple's poison. It killed quickly. It left nothing but a shell behind. But Marcus wasn't a normal soldier. He wasn't like everyone else. The Zarak were closing in. Emily could hear them, their voices, their strange language, a cold reminder of the threat they faced. They would be here any second, and there was nothing left to fight with. Marcus's grip on his rifle was loosening. The weapon slipped from his hand, falling to the dirt with a soft thud. His head lolled to the side, and he barely managed to keep his eyes open. Emily's hands moved faster, almost mechanically. She had to act now. She couldn't wait any longer. "Hold on, Marcus. Please, just hold on," she said, her voice cracking under the pressure. She pulled a vial from her med pack and quickly drew up the antidote, injecting it into his arm with trembling hands. She had never been sure if the antidote would work on a soldier who had already ingested the poison. But she had to try. It was all she had. "Stay with me, Marcus, please," she whispered again, her voice breaking. For a moment there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the silence of the battlefield and the soft hum of distant war machines. Then slowly, Marcus's eyes fluttered. "Emily," he whispered, his voice rough, almost lost. His words were weak, but he was still there, still fighting. Emily's heart leapt in her chest. He wasn't gone yet, he was still alive. "I'm here, Marcus, I'm right here, you're not alone, you hear me," she said urgently. "Stay with me, I'll get you through this, I promise." But even as she said those words, she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. The antidote was working, but so slowly. The poison was strong, stronger than anything she had ever seen before. Marcus's breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. He was fighting. She could see it in his eyes. He wanted to survive. He wanted to keep going. The Zarak were getting closer. She could hear their heavy footsteps, their weapons clicking into place. They weren't far now. She could feel the cold grip of terror tightening in her chest. But Marcus wasn't giving up. "I can't let them win," he said between ragged breaths, his voice weak but filled with determination. And in that moment, Emily realized something. Marcus was not just fighting for his life. He was fighting for everyone. He was fighting for Earth. "Neither can I," she whispered, her hand clutching his tightly. She wasn't going to let him die, not while he still had the strength to fight. As the Zarak advanced, she knew what had to be done, but she wasn't sure if Marcus would be able to move. Not yet. The antidote was still working, but it would take time. But Emily wasn't giving up either. She wasn't going to let them take this planet. She wasn't going to let Marcus die in vain. Not today. The Zarak were getting closer, their heavy footsteps like a drumbeat of doom. Marcus could barely hear them over the pounding in his head, the poison still raging through his body. But he felt Emily's hand on his, steady and warm, grounding him in this world even as his mind swam in darkness. He wanted to push the pain aside to stand up and fight, but his body refused to listen. His limbs were heavy, unresponsive. He felt numb, as if he were sinking deeper into the earth. But then, through the haze of his exhaustion, he heard Emily's voice, soft, urgent. "Marcus, stay with me. You have to fight, please." Her words cut through the fog like a beacon. Fight. It was all he had left. The human spirit was unyielding, and if there was one thing he had learned from every battle, every war, he wasn't done yet. Marcus blinked, forcing his eyes open again. The world swirled around him, spinning faster, but Emily's face was right in front of him, her eyes wide with fear. She was watching him, waiting for him to fight. And fight he would. His hand twitched. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was enough. Enough for Emily to see the spark of life still in him. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're still with me." Marcus wanted to speak, but his throat was dry, and every word felt like it would tear him apart. Still, he managed to croak out a single sentence. Get me a weapon." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She knew what he was asking. He wanted to fight. Even in his condition, even with death creeping closer, he still had that fire in him. She couldn't believe it. How could he have the strength to want to fight again? But Marcus wasn't just any soldier. He wasn't just any human. He was the embodiment of what Earth's resistance stood for: resilience, defiance, and the will to never give up, no matter the odds. Emily's hands were shaking, but she didn't hesitate. She reached for the sidearm on her belt, pressing it into his hand. It was heavy, but Marcus managed to grip it, his fingers curling around the cold steel. He lifted it with a painful grunt, his body trembling from the effort. "You're going to make it," Emily said, more to herself than to him. She wasn't sure how, but she knew she couldn't let him die without doing everything she could. Marcus turned his head, his blurry eyes scanning the horizon. The Zarak were close now, too close. Their war machines loomed over the city, their guns trained on the last pockets of resistance. He could see them through the smoke and dust, Zarak soldiers, their cold blue eyes focused on him, their weapons ready. But Marcus wasn't done. The poison still gripped his body, but his mind was clear, sharper than it had been in the past few minutes. He had to make them pay for everything they'd done, for every life lost, for every building destroyed, for every friend he'd buried. With one last, defiant breath, he pushed himself to his feet. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he stood tall. The pain was unbearable, but it didn't matter, not anymore. He lifted the gun and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the silence. The first Zarak soldier went down, collapsing in a heap. Marcus's vision swam, but his hand didn't shake. He fired again, and another soldier fell, and again, and again. Each shot was like a heartbeat, driving him forward, each pull of the trigger a defiance against the inevitable. The Zarak soldiers stopped for a moment, stunned by his audacity. They had underestimated the human spirit. They thought he was broken. They were wrong. The poison may have slowed him down, but it hadn't stopped him. Marcus staggered, his breath ragged and labored, but he kept fighting. He didn't care that his body was betraying him. He didn't care that death was closing in faster than he could outrun it. He had a mission, and he was going to complete it. The Zarak forces were pulling back, now realizing that Marcus was more than just a soldier. He was a symbol of everything humanity stood for. They didn't know what it was to fight with every ounce of your being, to refuse to give in, even when everything told you it was over. But they were about to learn. Marcus's legs buckled under the weight of the poison. But before he could hit the ground, Emily was there, her hands steady on his shoulders, holding him up. "You're not done yet," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm not gonna let them win," he whispered, his voice a rasp, barely audible. "You won't," she promised. "We won't let them win." With Emily supporting him, Marcus pushed forward. His body protested every step, but his heart was louder than the pain. His fingers gripped the sidearm like it was his lifeline, and he aimed it with what little strength he had left. Another Zarak soldier fell. Then another. The remaining soldiers hesitated, unsure of what to do. The tide had shifted. For the first time, the Zarak were unsure. Marcus had ignited something in them they didn't understand, something they couldn't defeat. But Emily knew they weren't out of danger yet. She could see the Zarak regrouping, their weapons ready to fire. The battle wasn't won, not yet. But she knew something the Zarak didn't. As long as Marcus was still breathing, as long as humanity still had one soldier standing, they would never surrender. "Let's finish this," Marcus said, his voice filled with an unshakable resolve. Together they would fight until the end. Together they would make sure the Zarak knew one thing: humanity was not to be underestimated. Not now, not ever. Marcus's vision was a blur. The poison was spreading like wildfire through his body, burning through his veins, clouding his thoughts. He couldn't feel his legs anymore, couldn't feel the weight of the weapon in his hand. But he knew he had to keep fighting. The Zarak were closing in, too many, too fast, and they would not show mercy. If he went down, the last hope for humanity might fall with him. But he wasn't done yet. Beside him, Emily's grip on his arm tightened. Her presence, steady and calm in the chaos, was the only thing keeping him tethered to the fight. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was a fierce determination in them. She wasn't going to let him go, not if she could help it. "Stay with me, Marcus," she said, her voice low but firm. "We're not finished, not yet." Marcus tried to nod, but his head was spinning. He felt his knees start to give way. The poison was winning, and he could feel his strength draining, but he refused to fall. Not now. Not while the enemy was so close. "I'll finish this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. With Emily's support, Marcus staggered forward, his legs shaking as he struggled to maintain his balance. His hand still gripped the sidearm, though his fingers were stiff, like they didn't belong to him anymore. His body was ready to quit, but his mind refused to stop. "Don't give up on me, Price," Emily whispered, as if she knew what was going through his mind. "Not now." The sound of Zarak footsteps echoed in the distance, their heavy boots like thunder as they approached. Marcus could see the outline of their war machines, towering over the city. The battlefield was littered with the wreckage of humanity's failed defenses. But Marcus, in his pain and exhaustion, still held onto the belief that they could win. He had to believe it. Through the haze of smoke and dust, he spotted them, the Zarak soldiers advancing toward them, their blue eyes glowing coldly under their helmets. Their weapons were raised, and they were not going to wait. He knew they wouldn't give him mercy. The only thing that mattered now was to make them regret underestimating a human. Marcus lifted the gun, though his arms felt like they weighed 100 pounds. He aimed at the nearest Zarak soldier, forcing his blurry vision to focus. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart thundering in his chest. "Now," he whispered, and then he pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and clear in the chaos of the battlefield. The Zarak soldier crumpled to the ground with a loud thud. Marcus could barely process the victory. His vision blurred again, his head spinning. But he didn't have time to stop. The others were still coming. With his last ounce of strength, Marcus fired again. Another Zarak soldier fell, its body hitting the ground in an unnatural way. Marcus barely registered it before his hand was shaking too violently to hold the gun. His fingers spasmed on the trigger, but it didn't matter. Emily was still there, still holding him steady. "Keep going, Marcus," she urged, her voice strained but filled with determination. "You can do this. We can do this." He tried to smile, though it felt like the last thing he'd ever do. His vision was fading fast, and his body felt like it was no longer his own. Every movement took every bit of willpower he had left, but he couldn't stop, not while there was still a chance. He fired again, and again. The gunshots seemed to echo forever, ringing out through the thick smoke that filled the air. Each shot, though shaky and desperate, found its mark. The Zarak soldiers were starting to retreat. The relentless march of their forces slowed, their once certain advance now stalling as they realized something. This human, this soldier, wasn't going to let them win. With every bullet that flew from his gun, a small piece of hope surged through Marcus. Maybe this was how it could end, not with their defeat, but with a victory, no matter how small. He wasn't alone. Emily was with him, and together they could push back the Zarak. But even as he fired, even as he held onto that fragile hope, Marcus knew the truth. He couldn't keep this up forever. The poison was still coursing through his veins, stealing his strength. The antidote had helped, but it hadn't saved him entirely. His body was shutting down. He could feel it with every passing second. His vision was dimming, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He couldn't stand much longer. "Emily," he gasped, his voice trembling with the effort. I caw." "No, Marcus," Emily said, her voice fierce. "You're not giving up, not now, not when we're so close." And she was right. They were close. The Zarak were losing their momentum. The soldiers were retreating, pulling back in confusion. Marcus could see it in their eyes, fear. The human spirit was something they hadn't counted on. The Zarak, with all their technology, with all their strength, had underestimated what it meant to be human. It wasn't just strength that made a soldier. It was the will to keep going when every instinct screamed to stop. And that will burned inside Marcus, even as his body failed him. He lifted the gun one last time, aiming it at the nearest Zarak soldier. His vision was almost gone now, the world reduced to a blur of shadows and outlines. But Emily's hand was still on his shoulder, steady and strong. That was enough. He squeezed the trigger. The soldier fell, and Marcus, his body finally giving in to the poison, collapsed into Emily's arms. They had won. The Zarak retreated, confused and disoriented by the resistance of one human soldier. They didn't know it yet, but the battle was theirs. Humanity had fought back, not with overwhelming numbers, not with technology, but with the resilience that made them human. And even as Marcus's body fell limp, Emily knew that he had given everything. He had made sure they would survive. The fight was far from over, but humanity's spirit had never been stronger. The battlefield was quieter now. The sounds of gunfire and explosions had faded, replaced by the heavy, haunting silence of a war that was not yet over. The Zarak forces were retreating, their war machines slowly pulling back into the darkness. The once thriving city, now a twisted ruin, was eerily still, save for the scattered remnants of humanity's final stand. Emily sat beside Marcus, her back against the rubble of a fallen building. Her breath was ragged, her body bruised and battered, but she didn't care. She was still alive. They were still alive. The Zarak had been pushed back for now. She glanced down at Marcus, who lay in her arms, his face pale, his chest still rising and falling, though barely. His breath was shallow, each one a struggle. The poison had taken so much from him, but his spirit had never broken. He had given everything. The weight of that hung over her, but she couldn't afford to stop now. She had to keep moving, keep fighting. There were still survivors, still people who needed help. There were still wounds to be treated, still lives to save. But Marcus had given them the chance to win. It was his bravery, his refusal to give in, that had turned the tide. He was the reason they still had hope. "Marcus," Emily whispered softly, her hand gently brushing his forehead. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she needed to say it, needed him to know. "You did it. You saved us." Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She had no time for grief, not yet. There was a movement to her side, and she turned, her heart leaping in her chest. A group of soldiers, the remaining members of the resistance, were making their way through the wreckage. They were battered, covered in dust and blood, but they were alive. She knew some of them, had worked with them in the past. They had been separated in the chaos of the invasion, but now they were here. One of them, a tall soldier with a scar running down his face, came forward. He paused when he saw Marcus, his expression softening. "Is he?" The soldier's voice trailed off, and Emily nodded silently. She didn't need to say the words. They all knew what Marcus had done. "We need to move," Emily said, forcing herself to stand. She could feel the exhaustion weighing on her, pulling at her muscles, but she couldn't stop. Not now. The soldier nodded. There's a safe zone a few miles out. We're heading there. It's our best shot. Emily didn't hesitate. She carefully placed Marcus's head down on the ground and began to move, her legs unsteady beneath her but determined. She couldn't leave him here. She couldn't leave him behind. But she also couldn't stay. There were more survivors and they needed her. "We'll take him," the soldier said, and Emily looked over, grateful for the help. Two others came forward and gently lifted Marcus, careful not to jostle him too much. "He won't die," Emily said, her voice firm. "He can't, he's too strong." The soldier didn't argue. He knew the truth. Marcus had defied every odd, every limitation of the human body. He had fought through unimaginable pain, through poison, through fatigue, and still kept going. There was no quitting in Marcus Price. As they moved through the ruins, Emily kept close to the group, her eyes scanning the wreckage for any signs of danger. The Zarak were retreating, but they wouldn't be gone for long. They would regroup and they would come back. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had seen what humanity was capable of. She had seen one man, one soldier, stand against the overwhelming odds, and she knew they could do it again. The Zarak might have technology and firepower, but they didn't have what humanity had: the will to fight, the heart to keep going, no matter what. The small group moved quickly, their steps careful but determined. There were no words between them, only the sound of their boots against the broken pavement. Every so often, Emily would glance down at Marcus, his still face a reminder of what they had lost and what they still had to fight for. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the safe zone, a small, makeshift shelter in the heart of the city. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a chance. Emily looked around, scanning the area for threats. The Zarak hadn't followed them yet, but she knew they would. They couldn't let their guard down. "Get him inside," Emily ordered. Her voice was steady despite the weight on her chest. She was a medic, a healer, but this was different. She wasn't just saving lives anymore. She was protecting everything that Marcus had fought for. The soldiers carefully laid Marcus on a makeshift cot, and Emily immediately began to work. She checked his vitals, administered what she could, and prayed that the antidote would be enough. She didn't have time to wait. Every second counted. She wasn't sure how much longer Marcus would last, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to give up on him. Not when he had never given up on them. Not when he had fought for every life, for every person, right until the end. The door to the shelter creaked open, and one of the soldiers stepped inside. His face was grim, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "They're coming," he said. "The Zarak are regrouping. They won't be far behind." Emily nodded, her jaw tightening. "We're ready. We're going to make sure they know that we're not done." She glanced at Marcus one last time. He was still breathing, still fighting, even in his unconscious state. And for that, Emily swore to herself that she would fight just as hard. They weren't done, not by a long shot. Humanity would rise again. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the battlefield, but its light felt different now. The fire and smoke still clung to the sky, but there was something new in the air, something that hadn't been there before. Hope. Emily stood outside the makeshift shelter, watching as the last of the human survivors took their positions. The soldiers were tired, broken, some of them with limbs wrapped in bandages, others with blank, haunted eyes. But they were standing. They were ready to fight. And they weren't the only ones. The Zarak were regrouping, just as they had expected. Their massive war machines loomed in the distance, and their soldiers moved with cold efficiency. Emily could see their numbers from here, too many to count, too many to take on directly. But there was something the Zarak didn't know. They didn't know that the heart of humanity had not been broken. They didn't know that one man, one soldier, had defied everything they threw at him and had made sure that Earth wasn't done yet. Marcus Price had bought them this time. Emily's heart clenched as she thought of him. He was still in the shelter, still fighting in his own way, though he was unconscious, his body weakened by the poison and the wounds. But there was no doubt in her mind that Marcus had given everything. He had sacrificed it all for this moment, for this last stand. The sound of boots crunching on gravel pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see the group of soldiers assembling, their faces grim, their expressions hard but determined. These were the last of the resistance. They had no more reinforcements, no more hope of rescue. They had to win this, or humanity would be lost forever. "Ready?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite the weight pressing down on her. "We're ready," the soldier in front of her said, a flicker of resolve in his eyes. We follow your lead, Doc. We owe him, Marcus, everything. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Marcus had been their hero, but now it was time for all of them to be heroes. They had to fight for what he had given them, their lives, their future. A loud, metallic roar echoed from the distance. The Zarak forces were moving in. Emily's heart raced, but she steadied herself. They had no choice now. It was fight or die. Form up, she ordered. We take this one step at a time. Do not give up. Do not let them take one more inch of this planet. The soldiers fell into position, spreading out across the rubble, their weapons raised and ready. They didn't have much in terms of firepower, but they had determination, and they had the will to survive. They would make every shot count. Emily moved to the center of the group, her hand gripping the small pistol at her side. Her mind was focused, her body moving on autopilot, as if everything she'd ever been trained to do was leading to this moment. The Zarak war machines were closer now, their massive forms like walking fortresses, each one bristling with weapons. But Emily wasn't afraid. She wasn't thinking of the odds anymore. She was thinking of Marcus, of the world they had to save, of the countless lives that had been lost. She was thinking of all the people who had believed that humanity would fall, and how wrong they were. The first shot came from the Zarak. A blast of searing energy shot toward their position, exploding into the ground with a deafening crash. The soldiers dove for cover, but Emily didn't move. She stood her ground, watching the enemy approach with cold determination. Another blast, the ground shook. And then a shout from one of the soldiers. They're coming in hard. Emily's heart pounded. She had to act. On my command, open fire. The Zarak soldiers were almost upon them now, their heavy footsteps thundering in the silence. Emily gripped her pistol tightly, her knuckles white, but she wasn't afraid. She had a job to do. Now, the air erupted with gunfire as the human soldiers opened fire. The sounds of their weapons were drowned out by the shrill screams of the Zarak, who fired back with their own weapons. The battlefield became a storm of fire and smoke. Emily's eyes darted from soldier to soldier, giving orders, directing their movements, making sure they didn't get overwhelmed. It wasn't just about survival now, it was about fighting back. It was about showing the Zarak that humanity wasn't finished. The human forces were outnumbered, but they fought like lions. Every shot they fired was with purpose, every movement filled with desperation, but also with a strange sense of pride. They were giving everything they had, and they weren't going to back down. Through the haze of smoke, Emily spotted the Zarak commander, a massive figure in shining armor directing the assault. If they could take him down, they might break the Zarak's momentum. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. Follow me, Emily shouted, her voice breaking through the chaos. She didn't wait for a response. She ran forward, dodging enemy fire, her heart racing. Her body was screaming in pain, but she pushed it aside. She had a mission now. The soldiers followed her, charging toward the Zarak commander. It felt like an eternity, but they reached him, and the battle raged around them. Emily's pistol barked in her hand as she fired, but it wasn't just her. The soldiers fought beside her, covering her, taking down the Zarak one by one. And then, with a final, resounding shot, the Zarak commander fell. The others hesitated, and for a moment the battlefield went silent. It was enough. The remaining Zarak forces faltered, confusion spreading through their ranks. Humanity's spirit had broken their resolve. Push them back, Emily screamed, and the soldiers surged forward with everything they had left. The Zarak retreated, the battle won. As the last of the Zarak forces fled, Emily collapsed to her knees, exhaustion sweeping over her. Her body ached and she could barely keep her eyes open. But they had won. Against all odds, they had won. And in that moment, Emily knew the truth. Marcus Price hadn't just fought for humanity's survival. He had fought to remind them of something even more powerful. That no matter what, no matter how many times they were knocked down, humanity would never, ever give up. It wasn't just a victory for today, it was a victory for the future. For every person who would stand tall and fight just as Marcus had. Humanity had risen.